The rain had just stopped when Robert Mitchell sat in his small apartment, staring at the thin envelope that lay on the table before him. Outside, the cracked street glistened with puddles reflecting the faint glow of street lamps. The radiator clicked but never grew warm enough. The walls were stained with years of neglect, and the single curtain sagged from a rusted rod. The room smelled faintly of old dust and damp plaster. It was all he could afford, and even that was uncertain from month to month. He shifted in his wheelchair, the familiar creak of the seat reminding him of the weight of his body and the legs that were no longer there. For years now, Robert had lived with the ache of loss, though not just the physical kind. He had gone to war with hope and duty carved into his heart, believing he was defending something greater than himself. But the war had taken his legs, his strength, and with it, most of his life. He had returned not to cheers and banners, but to silence, pity, and paperwork. His wife had stayed for a while, patient at first, but the endless doctor visits, the bitterness in his voice, and the shadow of bills piled higher each month eventually drove her away. His daughter Sarah, already grown enough to sense the rift, stopped visiting as often until she disappeared from his life completely. The veteran's pension kept him alive, if barely. Each morning he wheeled himself to the corner store to buy the cheapest groceries. Sometimes when he moved down the street, he could feel people's eyes on him. Some looked with pity, others with disdain, and some tried not to look at all. The ones who had once praised him as a soldier now crossed the street when he passed. In his heart, he carried the heaviness of being forgotten. To the world, he was a broken man, a shadow lingering too long. The envelope on the table seemed at first like just another notice, perhaps a bill, perhaps another reminder that he owed more than he had. But the seal on it was different. His hand trembled slightly as he tore it open. The words inside were written in the dry, formal tone of an official clerk. A relative, distant, almost unknown, had passed away. There were no other heirs. By blood, the estate was his. He inherited a property, it said, a mansion long uninhabited, listed as deteriorating, but still standing on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. For a long time, Robert sat staring at the letter, his mind trying to wrap around the idea. A mansion. The word itself felt strange on his tongue, like a dream from another life. He tried to picture it, but all he could see was a hollow shell, a crumbling house full of rats and dust. What use would such a thing be to him, a man who could barely climb a curb? It didn't take long for word to spread. In towns like Oak Ridge, gossip was faster than truth. By the time he rolled into the cafe the next morning, everyone seemed to know. They laughed when he passed, pretending their voices were quiet, but making sure he heard. The cripple got himself a palace, one said. Bet it collapses on his head before he even makes it through the door, another added. The sound of their laughter burned worse than the ache in his back. Robert kept his face still, but inside something twisted and flared. At City Hall, the official who handed him the property documents barely concealed his indifference. The man smirked as if he were dealing with a fool who had stumbled into an obligation rather than a fortune. You could sell it, you know, the clerk suggested in a flat voice. Some developers buy land cheap. The taxes alone will eat you alive. His words carried the weight of dismissal, like he was brushing away a nuisance. To them, all this inheritance was just another humiliation layered upon Robert's existence. But sitting alone that evening, Robert felt something stir beneath the bitterness. All his life since the war had been reduced to survival, to existing in the margins. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the house was worthless. But he was tired of being defined by their pity and scorn. For once, he wanted to face something on his own terms, even if it meant rolling into the jaws of disappointment. He had nothing left to lose, which meant there was, in a strange way, nothing to fear. He stared at the folded letter at the address scrawled in neat ink and felt the smallest flicker of curiosity. He remembered faintly the stories his father had told about a grand house that once belonged to their family long before fortune turned to dust. He had never seen it himself, only heard whispers of it. It was a place of old portraits and locked rooms where the past lingered too long. Now it was his. Not in some dream, not in theory, but in the weight of paper that lay in his hands. He imagined the faces of the men who had laughed, the clerk, who had sneered, the neighbors, who looked through him as if he were already gone. They thought the inheritance was another cruel joke life had played on him. But something inside him tightened, something stubborn, that had never quite died. The next morning, under a sky heavy with low-gray clouds, Robert loaded his meager belongings into his old car. The wheelchair folded clumsily into the trunk, its frame scratched and dented from years of use. He strapped himself into the driver's seat, turned the key, and listened as the engine coughed and wheezed before catching. His hands were steady on the wheel, though his heart pounded in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He glanced once at the building he called home, its cracked brick and broken windows, and then at the road ahead. Whatever waited for him in that house-ruined emptiness or something else entirely, he would face it. The laughter of his neighbors still echoed in his mind, but for the first time in a long while he welcomed it. He would let them laugh. Soon enough he would know whether fate had played him another cruel trick or whether the ruins of the past held something more. With a slow breath, Robert pulled the car onto the empty road, the letter with the address resting in the seat beside him. The city gave way to highways, the highways to back roads, and the back roads to stretches of countryside where the air grew heavy with silence. Each mile carried him further from the world that had written him off and closer to the mansion that now bore his name. And though he didn't yet know why, the thought filled him with a strange quiet fire, the beginning of something that felt like defiance. As he drove into Oak Ridge, the small town revealed itself in faded storefronts and quiet streets. Time seemed to move more slowly here, caught in the amber of tradition and routine. People glanced at his unfamiliar car, their eyes lingering a moment too long. He stopped at a gas station where the attendant, a weathered man with sun-creased eyes, regarded him with curious suspicion. When Robert asked directions to the Mitchell property, the man's expression shifted subtly. "That old place, nobody's lived there in decades. It's nothing but trouble." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Some say it's cursed. The Mitchell blood brings misfortune." He handed back Robert's change with slightly trembling fingers, as if the mere mention of the name carried contagion. Robert continued through town past a small diner where faces turned to watch him, pass past a hardware store with peeling paint, and finally to the marble-fronted building of Oak Ridge National Bank. He needed to settle some paperwork before claiming the property, the lawyer's letter had said. Inside, the air conditioning hummed against the growing heat of the day, and the polished floors reflected the fluorescent lights in cold, sterile strips. James Blackwood's office sat at the end of a short hallway, his name etched in gold on a wooden door. The bank manager was a tall man with carefully combed hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. When Robert rolled into his office, Blackwood's professional demeanor slipped for just a moment and revealing something closer to amused disdain. "Mr. Mitchell," the words fell like stones between them. "I was expecting you, though I admit I'm surprised you came in person rather than simply signing the property over to be sold." His desk was immaculate, free of dust or personal items, just neat stacks of papers and a single pen positioned perfectly parallel to the edge. "The Mitchell estate has been problematic for our community. Abandoned properties attract trouble, you understand." Robert said nothing, simply handed over the documents he'd been instructed to bring. As Blackwood reviewed them, his face remained impassive, but his fingers tapped an impatient rhythm on the desk's surface. "I'm authorized to make an offer for the property on behalf of a development company from Boston. They're interested in the land, not the structure." Blackwood slid a paper across the desk. $300,000, more than fair considering the condition. The house itself is condemned in all but official designation. The sum was more money than Robert had seen in years, enough to start a new life somewhere, perhaps even reach out to Sarah with something to offer besides his brokenness. For a moment he wavered. Then he remembered the laughter, the sneers, the dismissal. "I want to see it first." His voice was rough from disuse but firm. Blackwood's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "As you wish, but the offer has an expiration date. These developers don't wait." He signed the necessary documents with efficient strokes. "The property is legally yours now, though I doubt you'll thank me for it once you see it." As Robert turned to leave, Blackwood called after him. "One more thing, Mr. Mitchell. Eleanor Prescott has expressed interest in the property as well. She's a prominent businesswoman in our community. If you decide to sell, and you will, I suggest you speak with me first. Things can get complicated otherwise." The warning hung in the air, wrapped in courtesy but unmistakable in its intent. Outside the bank, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning clouds. Robert paused on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of unseen eyes from the bank windows behind him. A boy sat on the curb across the street, maybe 10 or 11 years old, skinny with a mop of unruly brown hair. Unlike the adults who averted their gaze or stared too obviously, the boy watched Robert with open curiosity. When their eyes met, the boy didn't look away. Instead, he stood, brushed off his jeans, and crossed the street with the direct confidence of youth. "You're going to the Mitchell house, aren't you?" The boy's voice was clear, his eyes bright with intelligence. "I'm Michael Parker. My grandma owns the grocery store." He pointed down the street to a small storefront with a faded green awning. "Everyone's talking about you." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just checking the property. My grandpa used to tell stories about that place." Michael leaned closer as if sharing a valuable secret. He said it wasn't really abandoned, just waiting for the right Mitchell to come back. His face was earnest, unclouded by the judgment Robert had grown accustomed to seeing. "Can I come with you? I've always wanted to see inside." Before Robert could answer, a sleek black car pulled to the curb beside them. The window slid down silently, revealing a woman perhaps in her 50s, with platinum blonde hair styled impeccably and eyes sharp as flint. Her makeup was perfect, her jewelry subtle but clearly expensive. Everything about her exuded wealth and the confidence that it brings. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume." Her voice was smooth practiced, like aged whiskey poured over ice. "I'm Eleanor Prescott. I believe James mentioned me." She didn't extend her hand, didn't invite the intimacy of touch. "I understand you've inherited the old Mitchell property. A burden, I'm sure, for someone in your situation." Her gaze flicked briefly to his wheelchair, then away, as if the sight disturbed some aesthetic principle she lived by. Michael stiffened beside Robert, his previous enthusiasm dampening in Eleanor's presence. "I've been trying to acquire that property for years. It's an eyesore, frankly, but the land has potential. I'm planning a resort development that would bring jobs, tourism, tax revenue to Oak Ridge." She smiled, a careful arrangement of features that conveyed determination rather than warmth. "I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. More than James's developers, I assure you." Robert felt a sudden instinctive resistance. "I haven't decided what I'm doing yet." Something cold flickered in Eleanor's eyes. "I admire your caution, but let's be realistic. That house isn't habitable, and the renovation costs would be astronomical. You'd be doing yourself and this town a favor by selling now." She handed him a business card, heavy cardstock, with embossed lettering. "Call me when you're ready to discuss terms. And do be careful out there. Old houses can be dangerous. Rotted floors, unstable structures." Her smile tightened. "It would be terrible if there were any accidents." With that, the window hummed closed and the car pulled away from the curb in a purr of expensive engineering. Michael watched it go, his face somber beyond his years. "She wants to tear it down," he said quietly. "She's wanted to for as long as I can remember. Grandma says there's bad blood between the Prescotts and the Mitchells going way back." He looked up at Robert with renewed intensity. "You're not going to sell it to her, are you?" Robert found himself strangely moved by the boy's concern. "I don't know yet. I need to see it first." "I can show you the way," Michael offered, his enthusiasm returning. "And I know someone who might help, old Mr. Wilson. He used to work there a long time ago." Robert hesitated. He'd planned to face this alone, to bear whatever disappointment waited at the end of this road in private. But there was something about the boy's straightforward manner, his lack of pity or judgment, that felt like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocation. "All right," he finally agreed, "but you'll need your parents' permission." "I live with my grandma," Michael corrected, "and she won't mind. She always says I need to spend less time with video games and more time with real people." He grinned suddenly. "Besides, it's summer vacation." The road to the Mitchell estate wound through thickening trees, leaving the small town behind. Michael directed from the passenger seat, pointing out landmarks only a local would know: the lightning-struck oak, the bridge with initials carved into its railings, the bend in the creek that marked the old property line. "Nobody comes out here much," Michael explained. "Kids dare each other to, but most are too scared. They say the house is haunted." His voice held a mixture of skepticism and fascination. "Grandpa said it's not ghosts people should worry about, but memories. He said some places remember things people want to forget." As they rounded the final curve, the trees parted to reveal a rusted iron gate hanging askew from a crumbling stone pillar. Beyond it, up a weed-choked drive, stood the Mitchell mansion. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He'd expected ruin, but the reality was more complex. The house was indeed decaying, roof sagging in places, windows boarded, or broken paint long since weathered away. But beneath the neglect, its bones remained proud. It was larger than he'd imagined, 3 stories, with a central portion flanked by wings on either side. Victorian in style with intricate woodwork still visible on the remaining porch columns and eaves. There was a strange dignity in its decay, as if it refused to surrender completely to time and abandonment. "It used to be beautiful," Michael said softly. "Grandpa showed me an old photograph once. It had gardens all around it, and a fountain over there." He pointed to an overgrown area where stone ruins poked through tangled vegetation. Robert parked the car before the gate and wrestled his wheelchair from the trunk. The path ahead was rough, uneven, hostile to wheels. He felt a flicker of defeat his first challenge, and already he was found wanting. But Michael, without comment or ceremony, moved behind the chair. "I can help push over the rough parts," he offered, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Mr. Wilson lives in that small house over there." He nodded toward a cottage visible through the trees, smoke rising from its chimney despite the warm day. "He might have a key." The cottage sat on what had once been part of the Mitchell estate, a caretaker's dwelling now separated by property lines drawn in more recent decades. Its garden was neat but simple, hardy plants that required little fussing. The porch had been modified with a ramp. Robert noticed a detail that kindled unexpected hope. Michael knocked on the door with the confidence of familiarity. After a moment, it opened to reveal an elderly man, tall, despite the slight stoop in his shoulders, with a face weathered by sun and time. His eyes, however, were sharp and clear, taking in the scene before him with keen assessment. "Michael Parker," the old man said, his voice gravelly but warm. "What mischief are you up to now?" Then his gaze shifted to Robert, and something changed in his expression. Recognition, surprise, and something deeper that Robert couldn't quite name. "You're Robert Mitchell." Not a question, but a statement of fact. "Samuel's great-nephew. You have got his eyes." He stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in." The interior of the cottage was spare but comfortable, walls lined with bookshelves and a fire burning low in a stone hearth despite the season. Thomas Wilson moved with the deliberate care of age, but his hands were steady as he prepared coffee. He'd been expecting Robert, he admitted, ever since word reached him of Samuel's passing and the transfer of the estate. "I was caretaker there for 40 years, he explained, settling into an armchair across from Robert. "Started working for your great-uncle when I came back from Vietnam. 2 broken soldiers finding use in each other, you might say." His gaze flickered briefly to Robert's wheelchair, a look not of pity but of understanding. "I couldn't maintain the main house after Samuel's health declined. Too much for one old man. But I've kept an eye on it." He sipped his coffee, regarding Robert over the rim of the mug. The town's never had much love for the Mitchell family. Too many secrets, too many whispers. But Samuel was a good man, carried burdens most wouldn't understand. "What kind of burdens?" Robert found himself asking. Thomas glanced at Michael, who was listening with rapt attention, then back to Robert. "The kind that come with knowing your family stood on the right side of history when it wasn't popular or profitable." He set his mug down with careful precision. "The Mitchells weren't always wealthy, you know. Samuel Mitchell I made his fortune after the Civil War, but not like most. He didn't exploit or steal. He built." Thomas stood and retrieved a framed photograph from a shelf, handing it to Robert. The image was sepia tone, showing a stern-faced man in late middle age standing before the mansion in its prime. Though the man's posture was rigid, his eyes held a fierce intelligence and something like defiance. "That's him, the first Samuel Mitchell, your great-great-grandfather." Thomas tapped the frame. "He built that house as both a home and a symbol, a testament to what a man of principle could achieve in a world that often rewarded the opposite." Robert studied the image, searching for traces of himself in the distant ancestor's features. "What does this have to do with Eleanor Prescott wanting the property now?" Thomas's face darkened. "Everything. The Prescotts and the Mitchells have history, bad blood going back generations. The Prescotts were slave owners before the war, then robber barons after it. They've always resented that piece of land being in Mitchell hands. Eleanor's just the latest to covet what isn't hers." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "But there's more to it than old grudges. That land holds secrets, histories that some would prefer stayed buried. Samuel knew this. It's why he never sold even when maintaining the property became impossible. He fixed Robert with an intent gaze. And it's why he left it to you. Me, Robert's confusion was genuine. I never even met him. But you're a Mitchell, and more importantly, you're a soldier who came home broken, but not beaten, like him, like me. Thomas's eyes held Robert's. He believed the right Mitchell would return when the house needed them most. Seems he chose you. The weight of expectations settled uncomfortably on Robert's shoulders. He'd come seeking escape, perhaps even quick money from a sale. Instead, he found himself entangled in family history and long-standing feuds he knew nothing about. The house is falling apart, he objected. What am I supposed to do with it? First you look, Thomas replied simply. Really look, that house has stories to tell if you've ears to hear them. He reached into a drawer and withdrew an old iron key, heavy and ornate. The front door lock was replaced in the 60s, but this still works for the side entrance. Less conspicuous anyway. He pressed it into Robert's palm where it sat cold and weighty. I'd go with you, but these old bones don't move like they used to. Besides, the house should meet you proper without interference. Michael, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. I can go with him, Mr. Wilson. I can help. Thomas considered the boy with a fond expression. Your grandmother's stories prepared you well enough, I suppose. He turned back to Robert. The boy's got good instincts. Knows more about that house than most in this town thanks to his grandfather. A shadow crossed his face. Kenneth Parker was one of the few who understood what the Mitchell legacy really meant. As they prepared to leave, Thomas caught Robert's arm. One more thing. Whatever you decide about the property, don't trust Blackwood or Prescott. They're cut from the same cloth, those two. They'll use any means to get what they want. His grip tightened momentarily. And be careful in that house. The floors are sound enough in most places, but it's not just physical dangers I'm warning about. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. Michael led the way, seemingly unfazed by the rough terrain, occasionally reaching back to help guide Robert's wheelchair over particularly challenging spots. The boys' chatter filled the silence, theories and stories about the mansion tumbling out in excited bursts. Grandpa said there are secret rooms inside rooms that don't appear on any blueprint, he explained as they approached the side entrance, a less grand door partially concealed by overgrown shrubbery. And passages that lead underground. During Prohibition, he said the Mitchells stored liquor down there, but that was just a cover story for something else. Robert inserted the key into the lock, which resisted at first, then yielded with a heavy click. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing darkness beyond. A musty odor wafted out, the smell of long abandonment, of dust and decay, and secrets kept too long. Stay close, Robert cautioned Michael, not entirely sure why he felt the need to say it. Something about the house's darkened interior stirred an instinctive wariness, a sense that they were being watched from within. The hallway they entered had once been a service corridor linking the kitchen to the dining room. Wallpaper hung in peeling sheets, and the floorboards creaked beneath the wheels of Robert's chair. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated through cracks in the boarded windows, lending the space an underwater quality suspended and timeless. They moved deeper into the house, Robert navigating, carefully testing each section of floor before committing his weight to it. The kitchen they passed through was a relic with an ancient cast-iron stove and cabinets whose doors hung askew. Fragments of china crunched beneath their passage, remnants of meals long since forgotten. The dining room beyond retained echoes of former grandeur. A massive table, its surface dulled by years of dust, dominated the space. Chairs still stood, positioned around it, as though waiting for guests who would never arrive. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, crystal pendants encased in cobwebs that transformed it into a spectral sculpture. It's like they just walked away one day and never came back, Michael whispered, his earlier exuberance tempered by the oppressive stillness of the room. They continued their exploration, moving through a formal parlor, with furniture draped in sheets like silent ghosts, past a music room, where a grand piano stood with its lid raised, keys yellowed, and strings long since gone silent. Each room held the same sense of suspended animation of life, interrupted rather than concluded. The main staircase presented a challenge that Robert had anticipated. While the ground floor was navigable if difficult, the upper stories seemed beyond his reach. He felt a familiar frustration rising, the limitations of his body once again defining his experience. There might be another way up, Michael suggested, sensing Robert's disappointment. Grandpa mentioned a service elevator for when the family had elderly relatives visiting. It was hand-operated, but it might still work. They found it off a smaller hallway, a simple cage elevator with a metal grate door designed for practicality rather than aesthetics. Robert examined it cautiously. The mechanism appeared intact, though decades of disuse had left it stiff and reluctant. "I don't know if it's safe," he admitted. Michael studied the contraption with the fearlessness of youth. "I can test it first," he offered, sliding the grate open and stepping inside. The elevator creaked ominously but held. "See, it's solid. And look, it works on a counterweight system. I bet we could get it moving." Together they managed to get the elevator functioning, its ancient pulleys groaning in protest. The ascent to the second floor was slow and nerve-wracking, the cage swaying slightly as it rose. When they finally reached the upper landing, both exhaled in relief. The second floor contained bedrooms, each with its own distinct character despite the uniform decay. One had clearly belonged to a child with a small bed frame and faded circus-themed wallpaper. Another was more feminine, with a vanity table still holding ancient perfume bottles and a tarnished silver brush. The master bedroom was grandest of all, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in rotting fabric. But it was the library that captured Robert's attention most powerfully. Located at the end of the main hallway, its double doors stood partially open as if in invitation. Inside, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, still filled with books whose leather bindings had cracked and faded with age. A massive desk occupied the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and ledgers undisturbed for decades. "It's like a time capsule," Michael breathed, running his fingers reverently along the spines of the books. Robert wheeled himself to the desk, drawn by an inexplicable pull. Among the scattered papers, a framed photograph caught his eye, a formal portrait of a family group from perhaps the 1940s. A stern-faced man, who must be Samuel Mitchell, stood behind a seated woman with two children flanking them. Their expressions were solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era, but there was something in their eyes, a shared intensity that transcended time. As Robert lifted the frame for closer inspection, a folded paper fell from behind it, yellowed with age. He picked it up carefully, unfolding it to reveal handwritten text in faded ink. The script was elegant but firm, each letter precisely formed. "To the Mitchell who finds this," it began, "if you are reading these words, then the house has found you as it was meant to. This place is more than wood and stone. The truth lies where memory sleeps. Look to the past if you would claim its future." The signature at the bottom was a flourish, a looping scrawl that spelled out Samuel Mitchell, followed by a date from 1893, the first Samuel, not Robert's great-uncle. "What does it mean?" Michael asked, peering over Robert's shoulder. Before Robert could answer, a sound came from somewhere above them, a distinct footstep followed by another moving across the ceiling. Both froze, listening as the footsteps continued, deliberate and unhurried. "Is someone else here?" Michael whispered, eyes wide. Robert shook his head slowly. "Thomas said the house has been empty for years." The footsteps paused, as if their unseen source was listening in return, then continued with renewed purpose, moving toward what must be the stairs to the attic. A door creaked open, then closed with a decisive click. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. "We should check," Michael suggested, his voice a mixture of fear and excitement. Robert hesitated. The rational part of his mind suggested trespassers, local teens perhaps, or someone who, like Eleanor Prescott, had interest in the property. But something deeper, more instinctive, whispered otherwise. The timing of the sounds immediately after they'd discovered the letter seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. "The attic would be up another flight," he said, gesturing to his wheelchair. "I can't. I could go look," Michael offered. "You could wait here." Robert felt a surge of protectiveness toward the boy. "No, we stick together." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. "Let's finish exploring this floor first. If we hear anything else, we'll reconsider." They continued through the remaining rooms with heightened awareness, both straining to catch any repetition of the mysterious footsteps. But the house had fallen silent again, watchful and waiting. In what appeared to be a study adjacent to the library, they found more personal effects pipes in a rack, reading glasses placed aside, as if their owner had just stepped away a chess game abandoned mid-play. On the wall hung portraits of Mitchell family members through the generations, their faces bearing varying degrees of resemblance to one another, a genetic echo repeating through time. One portrait in particular caught Robert's attention, a man who could only be the first Samuel Mitchell, the author of the letter. Unlike the stiff, formal pose in the photograph F. Thomas had shown them, this painting captured something more vital in the man. He stood beside a window light falling across his features in a way that emphasized the intensity of his gaze. That gaze seemed to follow Robert as he moved around the room, not in the generic way of poorly painted portraits, but with genuine awareness. "He looks like you," Michael observed. "Something about the eyes." Robert stared up at his ancestor, feeling an uncanny sense of connection. "What were you trying to tell me?" he murmured almost to himself. "What truth needs finding?" As twilight deepened, outside shadows lengthened within the mansion's rooms. They had explored most of the second floor, finding nothing more remarkable than the accumulated possessions of a family with history. No more unexplained sounds had disturbed them, though the sensation of being watched had not diminished. "We should probably go before it gets dark," Robert suggested, aware that navigating the grounds in his wheelchair would be challenging enough in daylight, let alone at night. "We can come back tomorrow." Michael nodded reluctantly, clearly torn between fascination with the house and the growing unease that came with encroaching darkness. They made their way back to the service elevator, the process of descending even more nerve-wracking than their ascent had been. Back on the ground floor, Robert felt a strange reluctance to leave. Despite its dilapidation, despite the uncanny footsteps and the weight of unknown history, the house had awakened something in him. Curiosity, yes, but also a sense of purpose he'd thought forever lost when his legs were taken. "What will you do?" Michael asked, as they made their way back toward the side entrance. "About Ms. Prescott and the bank, I mean." Robert considered the question as they passed through the dining room again, the chandelier above them catching the last light of day in its dusty crystals. "I don't know yet, but I'm not making any decisions until I understand what this place really is." His hand touched the pocket where the letter rested. "There's more here than just an old house." Michael grinned, a flash of teeth in the dimness. "I knew you'd say that. Grandpa always said the right Mitchell would know." As they reached the side door, a sudden chill swept through the hallway, raising goosebumps on Robert's arms despite the summer warmth outside. The door, which they had left ajar, swung shut with a decisive bang. Michael jumped, moving instinctively closer to Robert's chair. "Just the wind," Robert said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He reached for the doorknob, but before his fingers could close around it, a voice spoke from the darkness behind them. "Finally returned," it whispered, the words more sensation than sound, vibrating in the air rather than truly audible. "The last Mitchell." They both turned, Robert's heart hammering against his ribs. The hallway stretched empty behind them, shadows pooling in the corners. But at the far end, where the corridor opened into the main foyer, a figure stood, the silhouette of a man, tall and straight-backed, motionless in the gloom. Michael's grip on Robert's shoulder tightened. "Do you see?" he began, but the question died as the figure took a step forward, then another. It moved into a shaft of fading light that penetrated through a broken board on a nearby window. For an instant, the features were illuminated, the same stern face from the portrait in the study, the same intense eyes that had seemed to follow Robert's movements. Then the figure stepped back into shadow and was gone as completely as if it had never been. "Was that?" Michael's voice shook slightly. "I don't know," and Robert answered honestly. The rational explanations, a trespasser, a trick of light and shadow, their own imaginations heightened by the atmosphere of the house, seemed hollow in the face of what they'd both clearly seen. The door swung open again of its own accord, as if the house had made its point and was now dismissing them. Outside, the first stars had appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. They made their exit in silence, both processing what had just occurred. It was only when they were halfway down the overgrown drive that Michael spoke again. "You're coming back, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. Robert looked back at the mansion, its broken windows like dark eyes watching their retreat. In the twilight, it seemed both more forlorn and more dignified, a fallen giant still clutching the remnants of its former glory. The sensible choice would be to sell, to take Eleanor Prescott's money and wash his hands of this crumbling monument and whatever secrets it held. But the letter in his pocket seemed to burn with significance, and the image of Samuel Mitchell's ghost, for what else could it have been, lingered in his mind's eye. He had come here seeking escape from a life reduced to mere existence. Instead, he had found mystery purpose in the whisper of obligations that transcended his own small concerns. "Yes," he answered finally, "I'm coming back." That night, Robert stayed at the small motel on the edge of town, the only accommodation Oak Ridge offered to visitors. The room was basic but clean, with faded floral wallpaper and a bed that sagged slightly in the middle. He spent hours sitting by the window staring out at the distant silhouette of the Mitchell mansion, just visible on the horizon. He spread the documents from the bank on the small table beside him: property deeds, tax assessments, utility, disconnection, notices, the practical concerns of ownership. Yet his mind kept returning to the letter to the portrait, with its following eyes to the figure in the hallway that had appeared and vanished like smoke. "The truth lies where memory sleeps," he murmured, turning the phrase over in his mind. What truth whose memory sleep came reluctantly that night, and when it did, his dreams were vivid and strange. He stood in the mansion as it must have been, in its prime polished floors, gleaming chandeliers blazing with light, the rooms filled with the murmur of voices and the rustle of movement. He moved through these dream spaces not in his wheelchair, but on his own two legs, a freedom his waking self had long since surrendered. In the dream, he was both himself and someone else, observing and participating simultaneously. He watched as men in period clothing spoke in hushed tones in the library, exchanging documents, marking maps. He saw figures being led through darkened hallways, their faces tense with fear and hope. He felt the weight of responsibility, of dangerous knowledge, protected at great risk. And through it all, he sensed a presence just beyond his perception. Samuel Mitchell, the first of the line, watching, judging, waiting to see if his descendant would prove worthy of the legacy he had left behind. Robert woke with a start, the dream still vivid, his body damp with sweat despite the room's chill. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. The mansion stood dark against this brightening backdrop, its silhouette a challenge and a promise. He reached for the telephone beside the bed and dialed the number Thomas Wilson had given him. Despite the early hour, the old caretaker answered promptly, as if he'd been waiting for the call. "I'm staying," Robert said without preamble. "I need to understand what this place is, what it means." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle from the other end of the line. "Samuel was right about you," Thomas replied. "Rest today. We'll start work tomorrow." "Work? Reclaiming what's yours," Thomas answered simply. "It won't be easy. There are those who will fight you every step of the way, but you won't be alone." Another pause. "The house has been waiting for you, Robert, for longer than you know." As he hung up, Robert felt the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders, not as a burden this time, but as a mantle he was choosing to accept. Whatever secrets the Mitchell mansion held, whatever history lay buried in its walls and grounds, he would uncover it. For the first time since returning from war, broken in body and spirit, Robert Mitchell felt something like purpose stirring within him. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with difficulties both practical and mysterious. Eleanor Prescott and her allies would not surrender their designs on the property easily. The physical challenges of restoring even a portion of the decaying mansion would test the limits of his capabilities. And then there were the questions that logic and reason couldn't address: the footsteps overhead, the figure in the hallway, the sense of being observed by unseen eyes. The Mitchell legacy, whatever it truly was, seemed to exist in the liminal space between history and something older, deeper, more profound. But as he watched the sun rise over Oak Ridge, bathing the distant mansion in golden light that transformed its broken windows into blazing portals, Robert felt something he had not experienced in years. Not since before the war, before the loss of his legs, before his life had narrowed to mere survival. Hope. The battered wheelchair sat beside the bed, a reminder of all he had lost, all that limited him. But now it seemed less like a prison and more like simply another challenge to overcome another obstacle that would not define the boundaries of his existence. Whatever waited for him in that house, truth or delusion, redemption or ruin, he would face it on his own terms. The last Mitchell had returned, and he was not leaving. The morning sun crept through broken shutters as Robert Mitchell awoke on the threadbare couch in what had once been the mansion's drawing room. His first night in the Mitchell estate had been restless, punctuated by unfamiliar creaks and distant sounds that might have been the house settling or something else entirely. The blanket Thomas had insisted he take barely kept the pre-dawn chill at bay, and his body ached from the uneven surface. Still, there was something oddly satisfying about waking here, as though by simply spending the night he had staked a claim more meaningful than any legal document. The decision to stay in the mansion rather than return to the motel had been impulsive, made after Thomas and Michael had helped him bring basic supplies from town. The old caretaker had raised a bushy eyebrow, but offered no objection beyond practical concerns about comfort and safety. "The house will show you what it needs to," Thomas had said cryptically before departing, leaving Robert with a battery-powered lantern, some basic provisions, in the growing certainty that he had stepped into something far larger than a mere inheritance. Robert pulled himself into his wheelchair, with practiced movements, muscles tensing against the familiar strain. The morning light revealed the drawing room in stark detail, peeling wallpaper. Water stains spreading like continents across the ceiling. Furniture shrouded in sheets turned gray with decades of dust. Yet even in its decay, the space retained echoes of former elegance in the high ceilings, ornate moldings, and the grand fireplace whose marble surround remained intact despite years of neglect. He wheeled himself to the window, pushing aside the tattered curtain to survey what had once been formal gardens. Wilderness had reclaimed the land shrubs, grown wild flower beds choked with weeds, statuary half buried beneath creeping vines. Yet the bones of the original design remained visible like the skeleton of a magnificent creature beneath wasting flesh. A movement near the edge of the overgrown garden caught his eye, a flash of color against the green. Robert leaned closer to the window and recognized Thomas Wilson making his way up the weed-choked path, a large toolbox in one hand and what appeared to be a thermos in the other. Behind him trailed Michael, carrying a paper bag that likely contained breakfast from his grandmother's store. Robert met them at the side entrance, accepting the steaming cup of coffee Thomas offered with gratitude that went beyond the simple gesture. There was something profound in this moment. Three individuals of vastly different ages and backgrounds, united by a mystery none fully understood. "You look like you've seen ghosts," Thomas observed, his weathered face creasing with concern as he studied Robert. "The house make itself known to you?" Robert hesitated, uncertain how to describe his night of fragmented sleep and vivid dreams populated by figures from another century. "I heard things," he admitted finally. "Footsteps upstairs, voices too faint to make out. And all night I felt like someone was watching, waiting for something." Thomas nodded as though this was precisely what he had expected. "The Mitchell ghosts don't mean harm. They're guardians, not haunts. Been protecting this place and what it stands for long after their bodies return to dust." He set down his toolbox with a heavy thunk. "But enough of that for now. We've got work to do if you're serious about staying. Place needs securing before we can start on proper repairs." They began in the library where the mysterious letter had been discovered. Thomas examined the room with a craftsman's eye, assessing damage and muttering about water infiltration and wood rot. Michael busied himself organizing fallen books, his natural exuberance tempered by a surprising reverence for the task. As Robert watched them work, a question that had been nagging at him since yesterday finally found voice. "Thomas, you said there was bad blood between the Mitchells and the Prescotts. What exactly happened between them?" The old caretaker paused in his examination of a window frame, his expression growing solemn. "It goes back to the Civil War and beyond. The Prescotts were slave owners with a plantation in Georgia. They fled north after Sherman's march, bringing their prejudices with them. Samuel Mitchell. I was an abolitionist who fought for the Union. After the war, he used his position and wealth to help formerly enslaved people establish themselves, find work, buy land, build lives." Thomas moved to a bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines as if searching for something specific. "The Prescotts considered this a personal affront. They'd lost everything in the war and blamed men like Mitchell. But it went deeper than politics. Samuel exposed Jeremiah Prescott's involvement in hunting down escaped slaves for bounty before the war. The revelation destroyed what remained of the Prescott reputation." Robert processed this information, fitting it against the fragments he'd gathered so far. "And Eleanor Prescott still carries that grudge." Thomas's laugh held no humor. "Oh, it's more than a grudge now. It's become mythologized in their family, the stolen glory, the land they believe should have been theirs." Eleanor was raised on stories of Mitchell treachery, but her interest isn't just historical vendetta. There's something on this property she wants badly enough to spend decades trying to acquire it. Before Robert could press for details, a sharp exclamation from Michael interrupted them. The boy stood by the far wall, partially hidden by a bookcase, his hands covered in dust but his expression alight with discovery. "Look what I found." They joined him to find a section of wallpaper that had peeled away behind the shelf, revealing carvings in the wooden wall beneath. Intricate symbols had been etched into the wood circles interconnected with stars, arrows pointing in various directions, and what appeared to be compass markings. Robert traced one of the carvings with his finger, feeling its grooves worn smooth by time. The symbols matched nothing he recognized, yet they carried an undeniable sense of purpose, of meaning, deliberately encoded. "What are they?" Thomas studied the markings with narrowed eyes. "Samuel Mitchell. I was known to use symbols from the Underground Railroad signs and markers that helped guide those escaping north. But these are different, more complex." He gestured toward a particular configuration. "This pattern here appears in some of the old family documents, a kind of personal cipher," Samuel developed. Michael, whose eyes had been darting between the symbols with intense concentration, suddenly pointed to a recurring pattern. "It looks like a map," he observed. "See how these lines connect? They could be pathways." Robert felt a chill of recognition. The boy was right. Viewed as a whole, the carvings suggested a schematic of sorts, with the interconnected circles potentially representing rooms or spaces, the lines between them, corridors or tunnels. A map hidden in plain sight, disguised as mere decoration to all but those who knew what to look for. "The truth lies where memory sleeps," Robert murmured, recalling the phrase from the hidden letter. "Could these be showing what's beneath the house, the tunnels you mentioned?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Samuel built this place with secrets in mind. Rumors always said there were hidden chambers, passages that don't appear on any official blueprint. Your great-uncle confirmed some of it to me, but said the full extent of the network was known only to those who needed to know." His weathered fingers traced one of the pathways. "This could be our way in." Their exploration was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel outside. Thomas moved to the window with surprising speed for a man his age. "Prescott," he reported grimly, "and looks like she's brought company, Blackwood from the bank and a couple of men I don't recognize." Robert joined him at the window. Eleanor Prescott's sleek black car had been joined by Blackwood's more modest sedan and a pickup truck bearing the logo of the county assessor's office. The small delegation approached the house with the confident stride of those certain of their welcome or indifferent to its absence. "They're not wasting any time," Thomas muttered. "Best face them head on. Never show weakness to a Prescott. They can smell it like sharks. Scent blood." Robert smoothed his shirt, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance after a night on the couch. He caught Michael's worried expression and tried to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Stay in here," he instructed the boy. "Keep looking at those carvings, but don't disturb anything else until we return." The confrontation took place on the mansion's wraparound porch, its warped boards creaking in protest beneath the weight of the visitors. Eleanor Prescott stood at the center, immaculate in a tailored pantsuit, her platinum hair gleaming in the morning sun. Flanking her were Blackwood, looking uncomfortable despite his professional demeanor, and two men with clipboards, one wearing the insignia of the county assessor, the other bearing no identification at all. Eleanor's perfect smile never reached her eyes as she surveyed Robert, her gaze flickering dismissively over his wheelchair before settling on his face. "Mr. Mitchell, I see you've decided to camp out." Her voice dripped with false concern. "I must say I'm surprised. This structure was officially condemned 20 years ago. It's not only uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous." "As the current owner, I'm assessing the property personally," Robert replied evenly. "What brings you here, Miss Prescott?" She gestured elegantly toward her companions. "Given your unexpected interest in retaining the property, I thought it prudent to have an official assessment conducted. The county has concerns about safety violations, tax arrears, and potential environmental issues." Her smile tightened. "Purely routine, I assure you." Thomas stepped forward, his stance protective. "Any official inspection requires proper notice. You can't just show up with a clipboard and expect access." The man from the assessor's office cleared his throat nervously. "Actually, under county ordinance, 47B properties vacant for over 5 years can be subject to immediate inspection if public safety concerns are raised." He glanced at Eleanor, then back to Robert. A complaint was filed this morning. By me, Eleanor added smoothly, as a concerned citizen and neighbor. The insurance implications alone are staggering. The structure, this compromise, poses risks to adjacent properties. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. Robert, may I call you Robert? This doesn't need to be adversarial. My offer still stands with perhaps a bit more flexibility on the figure. You could walk away, forgive the expression, with enough to start fresh somewhere more accommodating to your situation. The calculated cruelty of her words struck like a physical blow, but Robert maintained his composure. I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision. The Mitchell estate stays in Mitchell hands. Eleanor's carefully constructed facade slipped for just an instant, revealing something cold and almost predatory beneath. Don't be foolish. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in. This house has a history that would curdle your blood if you knew even half of it. Then perhaps you should enlighten me. It would be my pleasure to discuss it at length, she countered smoothly. Over dinner, perhaps. There's so much about the Mitchell-Prescott history that never made it into official records. She glanced pointedly at Thomas. Stories get distorted when passed through certain channels. Before Robert could respond, the unmistakable sound of breaking glass shattered the tense standoff. All heads turned toward the source, a second-floor window, now sporting a jagged hole at its center. Moments later, Michael appeared at the front door, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and alarm. Mr. Mitchell, you need to come quick. Something's happening in the library. Eleanor's expression sharpened with interest. The library. How fascinating. Perhaps we should all have a look. Robert blocked her path. This is still private property, Miss Prescott. Your concern has been noted, but unless you have a warrant, this is as far as you go today. A silent battle of wills played out between them. Eleanor's cold determination against Robert's newfound resolve. Finally, she stepped back with calculated grace. Very well, but this isn't over. That house has stood empty for decades because no Mitchell could bear to live in it. Ask yourself why. She turned to her companions. Gentlemen, we'll reschedule our inspection through proper channels. Mr. Blackwood, see that the tax assessment paperwork is expedited. They watched in tense silence as the unwelcome visitors retreated to their vehicles. Only when the last car had disappeared down the overgrown drive did Robert release the breath he'd been holding. That woman is terrifying, he admitted. Thomas's weathered face was grave. And dangerous. A Prescott thwarted is a Prescott at her most vicious. She'll be back with reinforcements, legal, political, whatever leverage she can muster. He turned toward the house. Now, what was so urgent that Michael had to break a window to get our attention? They found the boy in the library, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. The room had changed in their absence. A section of the large area rug had been pulled back, revealing the hardwood floor beneath. But what captured their attention immediately was a trap door set into the floorboards, its brass ring pull gleaming dully in the morning light. I didn't break the window on purpose, Michael explained breathlessly. I was trying to move that heavy bookstand to see more of the carvings, and it fell against the glass. But look what I found underneath it. Robert wheeled himself closer, studying the trap door with a mixture of caution and curiosity. It was well crafted, it seems almost invisible when closed, designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding floorboards. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure it would remain undetected by casual observation. Have you opened it? He asked. Michael shook his head. I tried, but it's really heavy, and I thought, well, after everything you said about being careful. Thomas knelt beside the trapdoor, his joints protesting audibly. Good instinct, boy. In this house, rushing in headlong is a recipe for trouble. He examined the brass ring, then the wooden surround. No obvious locking mechanism, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. Mitchells were clever with their security. After a careful examination, Thomas gripped the ring and pulled. The trapdoor resisted momentarily, then lifted with a groan of long disused hinges. Stale air rushed upward from the opening, carrying the earthy scent of enclosed space. A narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness below. The tunnel system. Thomas confirmed, his voice hushed with something like reverence. Your great-uncle showed me one entrance near the old carriage house, but never this one. said some passages were family secrets meant only for Mitchell blood. Robert leaned forward in his wheelchair, peering into the darkness. The steps presented an obvious challenge, but his mind was already working on solutions. We need better light before we go down there. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Those stairs won't accommodate your chair. Robert met his gaze steadily. I didn't survive 2 tours in Afghanistan to be stopped by a staircase. If my ancestors built this, I'm going to see it. Just need to figure out the logistics. While Thomas retrieved more substantial flashlights from his truck, Robert assessed the situation with military precision. The staircase was sturdy but narrow with no railing for support. He could potentially navigate it by sitting and using his arms to lower himself step by step, but the process would be slow and potentially dangerous in the confined space. Michael watched Robert's calculations with thoughtful eyes. My dad was a firefighter, he offered suddenly. Before the accident, he showed me how they carry people downstairs when they can't walk. The boy demonstrated a modified fireman's carry. I'm not strong enough, but Mr. Wilson probably is, and I could help stabilize. When Thomas returned, they discussed the plan. The old caretaker nodded approvingly at Michael's suggestion. Carried my share of wounded in Nam. If you're comfortable with it, we can manage. And so they descended. Robert supported between Thomas and Michael, his wheelchair left behind his dignity, preserved by their matter-of-fact approach to the challenge. The staircase led to a narrow corridor with rough stone walls and a packed earth floor reinforced at intervals by timber supports darkened with age. The air was surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of ventilation system built into the design. Their flashlights revealed a passageway extending in both directions from the base of the stairs. To the left, the corridor continued for perhaps 20 feet before ending at a solid wooden door. To the right, it stretched further into darkness, with several smaller openings visible along its length. Which way? Michael whispered, his voice slightly higher than normal, betraying his nervous excitement. Robert considered. The door first. It's closer, and we can always explore the rest of the tunnel after. Thomas helped position Robert on a wooden crate they found nearby, allowing him to rest while maintaining some mobility. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and secured with an ancient padlock that had long since surrendered to rust. It yielded to pressure, crumbling away when Thomas applied moderate force. Behind the door lay a chamber approximately 15 feet square, its walls lined with shelves and storage cabinets. Unlike the rough-hewn corridor, this room had been finished with wooden flooring and plastered walls, though decades of dampness had taken their toll. Centered in the room stood a large table, its surface laden with objects covered in protective cloth. Thomas swept his flashlight beam around the space. Supply room, he observed, for those traveling the Underground Railroad. Food, clothing, medicine. He pointed to a cabinet with small drawers, each labeled in faded ink. Forged papers and identification. Your ancestor thought of everything. Robert pulled himself along the edge of the table, drawing back the protective cloths to reveal the items beneath. Maps with routes marked in faded red ink. Ledgers filled with coded entries. A wooden box containing medical implements. And most remarkably, a collection of daguerreotypes showing solemn-faced men and women, each image accompanied by a small card bearing a name date and destination. These were the people they helped, Robert said softly, touching one of the images with reverent fingers. My family saved them. Michael had discovered a shelf containing dozens of small cloth bags, each tied with string and labeled. What are these? Thomas examined one. Personal effects. Things too risky to carry, but too precious to abandon permanently. Mitchell held them in trust until they could be safely reclaimed. His voice held a note of wonder. Some of these must date back to the 1850s. As they continued exploring the chamber, Robert found himself drawn to a particular cabinet positioned against the far wall. Unlike the utilitarian storage elsewhere in the room, this piece had been crafted with care, fine woods, detailed carving, brass fittings polished to a soft glow by generations of handling. It stood out as something special, important beyond its practical function. The cabinet was locked, but the key hung on a small hook nearby, as if left deliberately accessible. Inside, Robert found documents organized in neat portfolios, property deeds, certificates of deposit, letters of credit, and what appeared to be investment records. Each portfolio bore a name corresponding to one of the daguerreotypes on the table. He didn't just help them escape. Robert realized the pieces falling into place. He protected their assets, their legal existence, gave them a foundation to build new lives once they reached safety. Thomas nodded. The Mitchells were always more than just station masters on the railroad. They were bankers, lawyers, record keepers. They preserved what others would have destroyed or stolen. He picked up a ledger, its pages yellow with age, and they kept meticulous records of it all encrypted in their family cipher. As Robert continued examining the documents, a particular name caught his eye: Parker. He pulled the portfolio, finding within it a deed to 20 acres of land in Oak Ridge County dated 1867. The certificate bore the name James Parker, and tucked inside was a faded photograph of a young black man standing proudly beside a freshly constructed cabin. "Michael," Robert called, his pulse quickening. "Does your family go back a long way in Oak Ridge?" The boy nodded. "Grandma says we've been here since just after the Civil War. Her great-great-grandfather was one of the first black landowners in the county." "Was his name James?" Michael's eyes widened. "Yes." "How did you know that?" Robert carefully handed him the portfolio. "Because my ancestor helped him secure his land and protect his ownership from those who would have taken it." He watched as Michael gently touched the photograph, making the connection with his own history. The Parkers and the Mitchells have been linked for generations. They spent hours in the underground chamber, piecing together the story it contained. The Mitchell family had operated one of the most successful stations on the Underground Railroad, helping hundreds of enslaved people escape to freedom. But their work hadn't ended with emancipation. Through the turbulent Reconstruction era and beyond, they had continued to protect vulnerable families, preserve their assets, and ensure their legal rights during times when the law itself was often an instrument of oppression. Among the documents, they found repeated references to the Prescott family not as allies but as adversaries. Jeremiah Prescott had not only hunted escaped slaves before the war, but had continued his persecution afterward, using his influence to challenge land claims, manipulate local courts, and intimidate newly established black landowners into abandoning their properties. The Mitchell family had stood as a bulwark against these efforts, often at great personal risk. "No wonder Eleanor wants this place so badly," Thomas observed grimly. "These records document generations of Prescott crimes. Fraud, intimidation, possibly worse. The family mythology she was raised on is a lie, and the proof is right here in these papers." Robert's mind raced with implications. But why now? These events happened over a century ago. Legally speaking, the statute of limitations has long expired on anything documented here. Thomas shrugged. Could be simple vengeance finishing what her ancestors started? Or maybe there's something else, something we haven't found yet. Their exploration was cut short by Michael's rumbling stomach, reminding them that hours had passed since breakfast. They secured the underground chamber, ensuring the trapdoor was properly closed and concealed once more, and made their way back to the main floor. As they prepared a simple lunch from the supplies they'd brought, Robert contemplated their discoveries. The hidden chamber had answered some questions, but raised many more. What else lay concealed within the mansion's walls and beneath its foundations? What secrets had his great-uncle protected so diligently, even as the house itself fell into decay around him? And perhaps most pressingly, how far would Eleanor Prescott go to bury those secrets permanently? As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of a vehicle on the gravel drive reached them. Thomas moved to the window, his expression darkening. "Speak of the devil. Blackwood's back, and he's not alone." Robert joined him at the window. James Blackwood stood beside his car, accompanied by a uniformed sheriff's deputy and a woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio. The trio approached the house with the deliberate stride of those executing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Thomas muttered something under his breath that sounded like a battlefield curse. Knew they'd pull something like this. County official court order, most likely. Prescott's not wasting any time. Robert straightened in his wheelchair, steeling himself for another confrontation. "Michael, I think it's best if you wait in the kitchen. But I want to help. You can. Listen carefully from there and remember what you hear, but let me and Thomas handle this." The boy reluctantly withdrew as Thomas opened the front door to their visitors. Blackwood's forced smile did little to mask his discomfort. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize for the second intrusion today, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention." He gestured to his companions. "Deputy Hayes from the county sheriff's office and Ms. Clayton from Adult Protective Services. The woman stepped forward, her expression professionally neutral. Mr. Mitchell, we've received a concern about your welfare. Living in a condemned structure without proper facilities could be considered self-neglect, particularly given your mobility challenges. She opened her portfolio, extracting a document. I have a court order authorizing an evaluation of your living conditions. Robert accepted the paper, scanning its contents with growing anger. The order cited concerns about his mental competence and ability to make sound decisions regarding personal safety. It was a transparent attempt to declare him unfit to manage his own affairs and, by extension, his property. This is baseless, he stated flatly. I'm a combat veteran with disabilities, not an incompetent ward of the state. My mind is perfectly sound, Mrs. Clayton's expression remained impassive. The evaluation will determine that, Mr. Mitchell. In the meantime, the court has authorized temporary measures to ensure your safety. Meaning, you'll need to vacate these premises until they can be properly inspected and certified safe for occupancy. The county can provide temporary housing, or if you have family. This is my home. Robert interrupted, his voice steady but firm. The only family I have is here. Deputy Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we don't want any trouble, but the order is clear. You can't stay here tonight. Thomas stepped forward, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. This is private property, and that order was obtained under false pretenses. We'll be contesting it immediately. He turned to Ms. Clayton. And as a licensed caretaker with 40 years' experience, I can attest to Mr. Mitchell's mental competence and confirm that all necessary accommodations for his safety have been implemented. The declaration caught Robert by surprise. He hadn't known Thomas held any official caregiving credentials, but the old man continued with such authority that even Miss Clayton seemed taken aback. Furthermore, Thomas pressed removal from his ancestral home would constitute unnecessary emotional distress, potentially triggering PTSD symptoms related to his military service. He gestured toward Robert with professional deference. As his designated care provider, I strongly advise against any forced relocation. The three visitors exchanged uncertain glances. This resistance clearly hadn't been part of their expected script. Blackwood recovered first, his banker's instinct for negotiation surfacing. Perhaps a compromise. Mr. Mitchell could relocate temporarily to Mr. Wilson's cottage on the adjacent property. It's wheelchair accessible and would satisfy the court's concerns while maintaining proximity to the estate. After some discussion, this arrangement was reluctantly accepted by all parties. Ms. Clayton would conduct her evaluation at Thomas's cottage the following day, and Deputy Hayes would file a report indicating cooperation with the court order. It wasn't a victory, but it was a strategic retreat that bought them time. As their unwelcome visitors departed, Robert turned to Thomas with newfound respect. Licensed caretaker. The old man's eyes twinkled with mischief. Army medic training and a 2-week home health aide certification course I took to help your great-uncle in his final years. Not exactly a lie, just a creative presentation of the facts. His expression sobered. But they'll be back with more firepower. Prescott's using the system against you, and she's got the connections to make it stick if we don't find a countermeasure. Robert's jaw tightened. Then we need to find it fast. There's something in this house. She's afraid of something worth destroying a man's life and reputation to keep hidden. As evening approached, they prepared for Robert's temporary relocation to Thomas's cottage. Michael had been collected by his grandmother, Catherine Parker, who arrived with additional supplies and an invitation for all of them to join her for dinner the following evening. Catherine was a formidable woman in her mid-60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and eyes that missed nothing. She regarded Robert with frank assessment. So you're the Mitchell who's stirring up Oak Ridge's hornet's nest. Her directness held no malice, only pragmatic curiosity. About time someone did. This town's been sleepwalking for decades. Before departing, Robert insisted on one more visit to the library. Something about the hidden chamber and its contents nagged at him, a missing piece in the puzzle they were assembling. While Thomas gathered the last of Robert's belongings, he wheeled himself to the section of wall where they'd discovered the carved symbols. In the fading evening light, the carvings seemed to shift and change, the interconnected circles and lines forming new patterns depending on how he viewed them. Robert traced one particular sequence, a circle containing a 5-pointed star connected to a larger circle by a line that dogleg to the right before continuing straight. A memory surfaced from his military training, map symbols, coordinates, directional markers. What if these weren't just random decorative elements or even simplified blueprints? What if they were actual navigational instructions? He followed the pattern with his finger, mentally translating the symbols into directions. Start at the small circle, perhaps the hidden chamber they had already discovered. Move through the connecting passage to the larger circle, a second chamber, but the dogleg in the line suggested a turn, a secondary passage they might have missed. Robert called Thomas over and explained his theory. The old caretaker nodded slowly, warming to the idea. Makes sense. Samuel would have created multiple escape routes, alternative paths, in case one was discovered. He studied the carvings with renewed interest. But we won't have time to explore further tonight, not with Prescott's wolves circling. Reluctantly, Robert allowed himself to be helped into Thomas's truck for the short drive to the cottage. As they pulled away from the mansion, he glanced back at its silhouette against the darkening sky. For just an instant, he thought he saw a figure standing at one of the upper windows, the same stern-faced man from the hallway the day before. Then the truck turned onto the main road, and the mansion disappeared from view. Thomas's cottage proved to be surprisingly well adapted for wheelchair use, with widened doorways, a ramp to the front porch, and a bathroom fitted with appropriate rails and fixtures. When Robert commented on these features, Thomas explained that he'd modified the space years ago to accommodate Samuel Mitchell during his visits in his final years. Your great-uncle spent his last decade in a wheelchair too. Degenerative condition, nothing like your injury, but the practical challenges were similar. Thomas busied himself preparing a simple dinner. He never complained, never let it define him. Said it was just the body catching up to what the soul had always known, that we're all just passing through this world, temporary in every sense. Over dinner, they discussed their findings and strategized their next moves. The court order presented an immediate challenge, but the real threat was Eleanor Prescott and whatever lengths she might go to in order to obtain the property. We need leverage, Robert mused, something that would make her back off. Thomas considered this, absently twirling his fork in his mashed potatoes. Those records we found might contain something, but we'd need time to go through them properly, translate the cipher. He sighed, and we'd need to make sure they don't disappear if Prescott manages to get officials inside the house. Could we move them here, Robert suggested? At least the most important documents. Thomas shook his head. Too risky. If they caught us removing items from the property while under a court order, they could claim we were destroying evidence or violating the terms of the evaluation. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully, but there might be another approach. Catherine Parker's grandson isn't the only young person in town interested in local history. My niece works at the county records office. She might be able to do some digging into the Prescott family holdings, find a connection to what we discovered. After dinner, despite his exhaustion, Robert found himself unable to sleep. The day's discoveries swirled in his mind, the hidden chamber, the historical documents, the generations-long conflict between the Mitchells and Prescotts. And beneath it all, the nagging sense that he was still missing something crucial, something that would make sense of Eleanor's obsessive interest in the property. He wheeled himself onto Thomas's small porch where the night air carried the scent of pine and distant rain. The stars spread overhead in a dazzling display, impossible to see from light-polluted cities, reminding Robert of nights in the Afghan mountains, where the sky seemed close enough to touch. From this vantage point, he could just make out the dark mass of the Mitchell mansion through the trees. No lights burned in its windows yet. It didn't appear abandoned or lifeless. Instead, it seemed to be waiting patient, as only something that has endured for centuries can be. A soft sound broke the night's stillness, footsteps on gravel approaching from the direction of the main road rather than the mansion. Robert tensed, scanning the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, and with a jolt of surprise, he recognized James Blackwood, the bank manager. Blackwood raised his hands in a placating gesture as he neared the porch. "I'm alone," he said quietly. "No deputies, no court orders. I just want to talk." Robert regarded him warily. About what? About what you found in that house today." Blackwood's voice held none of its earlier bureaucratic stiffness. Instead, he sounded tired, perhaps even afraid. "And about what Eleanor Prescott really wants with your property." Thomas appeared in the doorway behind Robert, alerted by the voices. His hand rested casually in his pocket, but Robert suspected it gripped something more defensive than car keys. "Kind of late for a social call, Blackwood." The banker nodded acknowledgement. "I know how this looks, but after what happened today, I needed to come." He looked directly at Robert. "You discovered a hidden room beneath the library, didn't you? With documents about the Underground Railroad and Reconstruction." Robert kept his expression neutral. "Why would you think that?" "Because Eleanor knows about it too. She's been searching for those records for years." Blackwood glanced over his shoulder as if expecting to find someone watching from the shadows. "What you don't know what she'd kill to keep hidden is why those particular documents matter so much to her family." The intensity of his words hung in the night air. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "You'd better come inside." Once settled in Thomas's small living room, Blackwood's professional demeanor crumbled entirely. His hand shook slightly as he accepted the coffee Thomas offered, and the careful composure that had defined him in previous encounters was nowhere in evidence. "I've worked for Oak Ridge National Bank for 27 years, he began. "The Prescotts have been majority shareholders since its founding in 1872. Eleanor's grandfather was chairman when I started, then her father, now her." He took a sip of coffee, grimacing at its heat, or perhaps its bitterness. "The bank's archives contain records going back to its establishment loan documents, property transfers, foreclosure proceedings. Most of it routine banking business." Blackwood set his cup down, leaning forward intently. "But some of those early records tell a different story. The bank was instrumental in dispossessing newly freed blacks of their land and property during Reconstruction. Predatory loans, fraudulent foreclosures, manipulated property records, all orchestrated by the Prescott family to consolidate their holdings and prevent the establishment of independent black communities in the county." Robert processed this information, connecting it with what they discovered in the hidden chamber. "And my ancestors fought against this." Blackwood nodded. "Samuel Mitchell used his legal training and financial resources to counter these maneuvers. He documented the fraud, represented families in court-established trusts to protect their assets. The Mitchells were a constant thorn in the Prescotts at preventing them from achieving complete control over the county's development." Thomas's weathered face had grown increasingly grim as Blackwood spoke. "But that was all over a century ago. Why would Eleanor care so much about ancient history? Because it's not just history." Blackwood reached into his jacket, withdrawing a folded document. "3 years ago, while digitizing old records, I discovered something that could destroy the Prescott legacy and fortune." He spread the paper on the coffee table. "This is a map of land parcels in Oak Ridge County as they existed in 1875. The highlighted sections show properties acquired by the Prescott family during that period, most through the bank's questionable practices." Robert studied the map. The highlighted areas formed an irregular pattern across the county, concentrating especially in the northern region, near what was now the Mitchell estate. "Now compare it with this." Blackwood produced a second document, a modern geological survey map. "This was commissioned by Eleanor last year, though few know about it. It shows potential mineral deposits throughout the county." When the maps were overlaid, the pattern became immediately clear. The properties the Prescotts had so aggressively acquired in the 1870s corresponded almost perfectly with areas now identified as containing significant mineral resources. "Copper primarily," Blackwood explained, "with traces of gold and silver, more economically viable for mining with 19th century technology, but extremely valuable today. Eleanor's been quietly buying up the remaining parcels for years, positioning her family company for a major mining operation." Robert's mind raced ahead. "But she can't move forward as long as questions remain about how the Prescotts acquired the original properties. And those questions would definitely arise if anyone saw the documents we found." Blackwood nodded soberly. "Precisely. The records in your house could prove the original land transfers were fraudulent, which might invalidate subsequent sales and inheritances. At minimum, it would trigger legal challenges from the descendants of those who were dispossessed, tying up the mining project in litigation for years." "And the Mitchell property itself," Thomas asked, "where does it fall on that mineral map?" Blackwood's expression confirmed what they had already suspected. "It's potentially the richest deposit in the county. The main vein appears to run directly beneath your land, extending under what used to be the old Parker homestead as well." A heavy silence fell as they absorbed the implications. Eleanor Prescott wasn't merely carrying forward an ancient family grudge. She was protecting a potential fortune and preventing a historical injustice from disrupting her plans. The stakes were far higher than Robert had imagined. "She'll come at you with everything she has," Blackwood warned. The court order today was just the opening move. "She has judges in her pocket, influence with county officials, and resources you can't match in a direct fight." He leaned forward intently. "But she has one vulnerability: she can't afford public scrutiny of her family's historical practices or her current mining plans. She's been operating in the shadows, and that's where she's strongest." Robert studied the banker with newfound appreciation. "Why are you telling us this? You work for her." Blackwood's expression tightened. "My grandfather was Howard Jenkins. His mother was born enslaved, gained her freedom during the war, and managed to acquire a small parcel of land near what's now the county park." His voice held quiet dignity. "That land was taken through one of those predatory loans in 1874. My family never recovered from that loss, not financially, not emotionally." The revelation hung in the air, reshaping their understanding of the man before them. Blackwood straightened his shoulders, some of his professional composure returning. "I've spent my career working within a system built by people who destroyed my family's future. I told myself it was the practical choice, the way to provide for my own children. But seeing those records today, knowing that proof of what happened might actually exist." His voice trailed off momentarily. "Some debts transcend generations, Mr. Mitchell. Some wrongs cry out for righting no matter how much time has passed." As the night deepened around Thomas's cottage, the three men formulated a plan. Blackwood couldn't openly oppose Eleanor without risking his career, and possibly worse, but he could provide information and warn them of her next moves. Thomas would contact his niece at the county records office to begin researching the historical property transfers. And Robert would need to find a way back into the mansion despite the court order, to continue exploring the tunnel system and locate any additional documents that might strengthen their position. "We need to move quickly," Blackwood advised as he prepared to leave. "Once Eleanor realizes I've talked to you, my usefulness as an inside source ends." He hesitated at the door. "Be careful. The Prescotts didn't achieve their position by playing fair. If she can't beat you legally, she may try other methods." After Blackwood's departure, Robert and Thomas sat in contemplative silence. The scope of what they faced had expanded dramatically, no longer merely a battle over one property, but potentially a reckoning that could reshape the county's understanding of its own history. "Your ancestor built more than a house," Thomas observed finally. "He constructed a fortress to protect truth against time and greed. The question is whether we're worthy inheritors of that mission." Robert gazed out the window toward the dark silhouette of the mansion barely visible through the trees. The weight of responsibility settled over him, not just to his family's legacy, but to all those whose stories and rights had been preserved within those walls. For the first time since losing his legs in combat, he felt the stirring of a purpose larger than mere survival. "We'll need help," he acknowledged. "More than just the three of us." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Catherine Parker should be the first to know. If what Blackwood showed us is correct, her family's land was among those taken, and through her we might reach others in the community whose ancestors were affected." He smiled slightly. "Plus, that woman knows everyone in town worth knowing. If anyone can rally support without tipping off Prescott, it's Catherine." As they prepared for bed, a distant rumble of thunder announced an approaching storm. Robert paused in the process of transferring from his wheelchair, listening to the wind rising through the trees. The storm felt symbolic somehow, a gathering force mirroring the conflict brewing around the Mitchell inheritance. Through the window, a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the mansion on the hill. For an instant, Robert thought he saw figures moving within its darkened rooms, shadows passing before windows, gathering as if in council. Then, darkness returned, leaving him uncertain whether his eyes had played tricks on him. What was certain, however, was the path forward. Tomorrow they would return to the mansion court order or no. They would continue unraveling the threads of history that bound the Mitchells, the Prescotts, the Parkers, and countless others whose names had been preserved in those underground chambers. And perhaps in doing so, they would finally understand what the first Samuel Mitchell had meant when he wrote that the truth lay where memory slept. As the first heavy raindrops struck the cottage roof, Robert closed his eyes, surrendering to exhaustion. In his dreams, he walked the tunnels beneath the mansion, guided by the stern-faced ghost of his ancestor, moving ever deeper into the earth toward a light that promised both revelation and danger in equal measure. Morning light filtered through the cottage windows, revealing dust motes dancing in golden beams. Robert woke to the smell of coffee and the gentle murmur of voices from the kitchen. His body ached from the unfamiliar bed, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years, focused by purpose and the weight of responsibility that had settled on him since discovering the secrets beneath the Mitchell mansion. The voices belonged to Thomas and Catherine Parker, who had arrived early bearing fresh pastries from her store and a determined expression that brooked no argument. She had established herself at Thomas's small kitchen table, surrounded by papers and a laptop computer that seemed incongruous against her traditional appearance. "The evaluation from Adult Protective Services is scheduled for 11, she informed Robert as he wheeled himself into the kitchen. "I've taken the liberty of contacting Meredith Sawyer. She's a lawyer in town, specializes in elder rights and disability advocacy. She'll be here to represent you." Robert accepted the coffee Catherine poured with a nod of thanks. Blackwood said Eleanor has judges in her pocket. Will a lawyer make any difference? Catherine's laugh held no humor. Meredith clerked for the Supreme Court before returning to Oak Ridge to care for her mother. She knows her business, and more importantly, she knows exactly which regulations to cite when governmental overreach occurs. She tapped a folder on the table. "Besides, we've been doing some homework. That court order has irregularities that won't stand up to proper scrutiny." The morning unfolded according to Catherine's orchestration. Meredith Sawyer arrived at 10:30, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a briefcase that had seen better days. She reviewed the situation with brisk efficiency, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When Ms. Clayton from Adult Protective Services arrived accompanied by Deputy Hayes, she found herself facing not a vulnerable disabled veteran, but a prepared legal defense. Meredith calmly pointed out procedural errors in the court order, questioned the jurisdiction of the county in matters of federal Veterans Affairs, and highlighted potential violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act inherent in the assumption that Robert's physical disability might indicate mental incapacity. The evaluation proceeded, but with Meredith present, it transformed from an assessment of Robert's competence into a documentation of the appropriate accommodations already in place at Thomas's cottage. Ms. Clayton, clearly recognizing she had been deployed as a pawn in Eleanor's game, conducted her evaluation with professional thoroughness, but without the presumption of incompetence that had colored her initial approach. By early afternoon, she had completed her report, which would recommend no further intervention. "The court will receive my findings by tomorrow morning," she informed them, a hint of apology in her voice. "For what it's worth, I don't appreciate being misled about the circumstances of this case." After she departed, the tension in the cottage eased slightly. Meredith gathered her papers, her expression thoughtful. "This won't be the end of it. Prescott has too much invested to back down after one setback. She'll try another angle." She fixed Robert with a direct gaze. "You need to move quickly to solidify your position. Find whatever evidence exists about the historical land theft and get it documented officially before she can prevent you from accessing the property again." Catherine had been making calls throughout the morning, and now she reported the results of her networking. "I've spoken with several families in town whose ancestors might have been affected by the Prescott land grabs. Most are cautious. Eleanor's influence runs deep, but they're curious, especially after I mentioned the possibility of documented evidence. We need to get back into the mansion." Robert stated, the immediacy of this necessity weighing on him. "Today, if possible." Thomas nodded agreement. "The court order only prevented you from sleeping there. Technically, you can still visit your own property during daylight hours. And I think I know where we need to look next," Robert added, describing his theory about the carved symbols functioning as a map to the tunnel system. "If I'm right, there's a second chamber we haven't found yet, one that might contain the specific evidence we need." They formulated their plan over lunch. Catherine would host a gathering of potential allies that evening, families whose ancestors had been victims of the Prescott's schemes. Meanwhile, Robert, Thomas, and Michael would return to the mansion to continue exploring the tunnel system beneath the library. "Be careful," Catherine warned as they prepared to leave. "Eleanor will be watching the property. If she sees activity, she might take more direct action." The drive to the Mitchell estate was tense with anticipation. Thomas took a circuitous route, watching for any sign they were being followed. Michael collected from the grocery store where he'd been helping his grandmother bounced, with barely contained excitement in the back seat. His earlier fear transformed into determination after learning how his own family history connected to the Mitchell legacy. The mansion loomed against the afternoon sky, its broken windows and sagging roofline somehow less forlorn now that purpose had been restored to its existence. They entered through the side door, moving cautiously through the silent rooms. Everything appeared undisturbed, no sign that Eleanor or her agents had entered during their absence. In the library, Robert directed them to the trap door leading to the underground chamber. According to the carvings, there should be a second passage we missed yesterday. Something off the main corridor may be concealed. Descending into the tunnel system proved easier, this time their movements more coordinated, as they helped Robert navigate the narrow staircase. At the bottom, they paused to orient themselves, flashlight beams cutting through the subterranean darkness. The symbols showed a dog-leg turn, Robert recalled studying the main corridor. A secondary passage branching off to the right, then continuing straight. They moved methodically along the earthen passageway, examining the walls for any sign of a hidden opening. The main corridor extended perhaps 50 feet before ending at a collapsed section that had sealed whatever lay beyond. But halfway down its length, Thomas's flashlight caught something unusual, a timber support beam that protruded slightly more than the others, its surface worn in a pattern that suggested repeated handling. Michael was the first to understand its significance. It's a lever, he demonstrated by gripping the beam and applying pressure. With a groan of ancient mechanisms, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrower passage that bent sharply to the right before disappearing into darkness. The secondary tunnel was more carefully constructed than the main corridor, its walls lined with brick rather than rough stone, its ceiling higher and reinforced with metal supports that had resisted the decades remarkably well. They followed it for perhaps 30 yards before it widened into a chamber, similar to the one they had discovered the previous day, but larger and more elaborately furnished. Unlike the first room, which had served primarily as storage for the Underground Railroad's operations, this space appeared to have been designed for extended habitation. A small stove stood against one wall, its chimney pipe disappearing into a shaft that presumably provided ventilation. Cots lined another wall, their frames intact, though their bedding had long since deteriorated. A table and chairs occupied the center of the room, arranged as if for a meeting that had been interrupted decades ago. Most significantly, one entire wall was occupied by a substantial cabinet system, its dozens of drawers and compartments labeled in the same meticulous hand they had observed in the ledgers from the first chamber. But these labels bore different information, names of properties, dates, and what appeared to be case numbers. Legal records, Thomas surmised, opening one of the drawers to reveal folders filled with documents. Court cases, property disputes, evidence of fraud. Your ancestor was building cases against the Prescotts and others who were stealing land from freed slaves and their descendants. Robert pulled out a folder at random, opening it to find correspondence between Samuel Mitchell I and a family named Johnson regarding their farm in the northern part of the county. The letters detailed the Prescott Bank's attempts to foreclose on their property through manipulation of loan terms and falsified payment records. Samuel had represented the family in court, and attached to the correspondence was a court decision in the Johnsons' favor, one of the rare victories against the powerful Prescott interests. As they continued examining the cabinet's contents, a pattern emerged. Samuel Mitchell, retrained as a lawyer before the Civil War, had systematically documented dozens of cases of fraud, intimidation, and legal manipulation by the Prescott family and their associates. Some cases he had fought in court, others he had documented for future legal action. Still others he had apparently settled through direct negotiation with the perpetrators. This is what Eleanor's afraid of, Robert said, the scope of their discovery becoming clear. Not just a few isolated incidents, but a systematic pattern of corruption spanning decades. Enough to destroy the foundation of the Prescott fortune and reputation. One drawer in particular caught Thomas's attention. Labeled Prescott Special Holdings. It contained maps similar to the one Blackwood had shown them, but with additional annotations in Samuel's precise handwriting. The maps detailed mineral surveys conducted in the 1870s, identifying copper and silver deposits throughout the northern part of the county. Alongside these were records of how the Prescotts had targeted properties overlying these deposits, using the bank to acquire them through foreclosure or forced sales. They knew, Thomas said softly, connecting the historical dots. Even back then, they knew about the minerals. They weren't just grabbing land randomly, they were securing mining rights for future exploitation. Michael, who had been exploring the far side of the chamber, called them over to a discovery of his own. A smaller cabinet stood apart from the main filing system, its surface adorned with the same star and circle motifs they had seen carved into the library wall. Inside were documents of a different nature. Personal correspondence between Samuel Mitchell I and dozens of families he had helped both through the Underground Railroad and in the turbulent years after emancipation. One letter in particular stood out, written in a careful hand on paper that had yellowed with age. Mr. Mitchell, you asked why I would entrust my family's future to your keeping when so many white men have betrayed us before. I can only say that while most look at my children and see property or problems, you see people. Should anything befall me, I know you will honor your promise to protect what is rightfully theirs until they or their descendants can claim it. May God preserve you and your line for the service you have done to mine. With deepest respect, James Parker. Michael held the letter with trembling hands, the connection to his own ancestry, overwhelming in its immediacy. This was my great-great-great-grandfather, he whispered, tracing the signature with reverent fingers. He knew your ancestor would keep his word even across generations. The moment of connection was shattered by a sound from above the unmistakable creak of floorboards in the library. Someone had entered the mansion. They froze, listening intently as footsteps moved directly overhead, then spread out in what sounded like a search pattern. Thomas motioned for silence, extinguishing his flashlight. The others followed suit, plunging the underground chamber into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of light filtering down from the trapdoor they had left open. The footsteps continued now, accompanied by the murmur of voices too indistinct to identify. We need to secure these documents. Robert whispered, the vulnerability of their position suddenly painfully clear. If Eleanor's people find this chamber, everything could be destroyed. Thomas nodded grimly. The most important papers first. We can hide them in my truck if we can get out without being spotted. Working in near darkness, they began sorting through the cabinets, selecting the most crucial documents, those directly linking the Prescott family to fraudulent land acquisitions, particularly those pertaining to properties now known to contain mineral deposits. They worked methodically, but with increasing urgency as the footsteps overhead continued their systematic search of the mansion. Robert, less mobile in the confined space, coordinated their efforts, identifying priority documents based on what Blackwood had told them about Eleanor's mining plans. Thomas packed the selected papers into a canvas bag he had brought for collecting tools. Michael kept watch near the tunnel entrance, alert for any sign the searchers had discovered the trapdoor. The boy's sharp intake of breath alerted them to danger. They're in the library now, he whispered. At least 3 people. The footsteps had indeed entered the room directly above them, moving with the deliberate pace of professionals conducting a thorough search. A beam of light swept across the floor above, visible through the cracks around the trapdoor's edge. They were looking for something specific, and given Eleanor's knowledge of the mansion's secrets, the hidden entrance was likely their target. We need to close the trap door, Thomas urged, his voice barely audible. If they find it open, they'll know we're down here. But closing it meant potentially trapping themselves in the tunnel system with unknown searchers above, and only one exit they were aware of. The alternative, however, was worse, being discovered with the very documents Eleanor was desperate to destroy. Robert made the decision. Close it. Then we head deeper into the tunnels. There must be another way out. The original design would have included escape routes in case the main entrance was compromised. Thomas nodded agreement and moved silently up the passage toward the stairs. Michael remained with Robert, helping gather the last of the critical documents. Above them, the footsteps had paused, concentrated in one area of the library. They were examining the bookcase that concealed the carved symbols. Thomas returned moments later, his expression grim. Trapdoors closed, but they're getting close. One of them mentioned checking the floor for hollow spots. He retrieved a folded paper from his pocket. I made a rough copy of the carved map before we left yesterday, just in case. If there's another exit, it should be shown here. They studied the diagram by the dim light of a covered flashlight. The symbols did indeed indicate a second passage leading from the larger chamber, a line extending in the opposite direction from the way they had entered, punctuated by smaller circles that might represent additional rooms or junctions. This way, Robert directed, pointing toward the back of the chamber, where an archway led to a continuation of the brick-lined tunnel. With Thomas supporting Robert and Michael carrying the canvas bag of documents, they moved deeper into the underground complex, away from the searchers above. The passage descended, gradually curving in a way that suggested it was leading beyond the mansion's foundation and potentially toward the surrounding grounds. The air grew damper, the walls glistening with moisture that reflected their muted flashlight beams. After perhaps 50 yards, they reached a junction where the tunnel split in three directions. "Which way?" Michael whispered, the weight of the canvas bag beginning to strain his young shoulders. Robert consulted Thomas's drawing of the carved symbols. "The middle path should lead to another chamber, possibly another exit. The right fork appears to dead end after a short distance. The left," he squinted at the markings. "The left might connect to a different system entirely, something extending off the property." They chose the middle passage, moving with increased caution as the tunnel's condition deteriorated. In places, the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing them to navigate around fallen debris. The path narrowed, making Robert's progress more challenging, despite Thomas's assistance. Eventually, the passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the previous two, but clearly designed for a specific purpose. Against the far wall stood what appeared to be a primitive elevator mechanism, a platform attached to a system of pulleys and counterweights, positioned beneath a shaft that extended upward into darkness. "Emergency exit," Thomas surmised, examining the mechanism with his flashlight. "Probably leads to an outbuilding on the ground, something that wouldn't draw attention if someone emerged from it." Robert studied the elevator with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Can it still work after all these years? Thomas inspected the ropes and counterweights, testing their integrity with careful pressure. The ropes are hemp, but high quality, some kind of preservative treatment on them. The mechanism is simple but solid. He nodded slowly. With some caution, yes, it could work. It's designed to be operated by one person pulling on this rope while standing on the platform. A sound from the tunnel behind them accelerated their decision-making. Distant voices echoing through the passage they had traveled. The searchers had found the trap door and entered the tunnel system. "No choice now," Robert stated grimly. "We go up." The elevator platform was approximately 4 feet square, large enough to accommodate all three of them, but with little room to spare. Robert positioned himself in the center with Thomas and Michael on either side, ready to assist with the pulley system. The canvas bag of documents rested across Robert's lap, their accumulated weight a tangible reminder of what was at stake. Thomas gripped the main rope, braced himself, and began to pull. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened then. With a groan of ancient mechanisms awakening, the platform shuddered and began to rise. They ascended slowly, the shaft around them, close enough to touch on all sides, the darkness above, impenetrable, until Thomas directed his flashlight upward to reveal what appeared to be a wooden hatch, perhaps 20 feet above. The voices below grew louder. Their pursuers had reached the chamber with the elevator shaft. A beam of light flashed upward, catching the underside of the rising platform. "They're escaping through the shaft," a male voice called, followed by the sound of running feet. A sharp crack echoed through the confined space. A gunshot, the bullet splintering wood near the pulley mechanism. Thomas flinched but maintained his grip on the rope, increasing his efforts. Michael, his young face pale with fear, braced himself against the platform's railing. "Almost there." Thomas grunted, his arms straining with the effort of pulling them upward. The wooden hatch above was now clearly visible, weathered boards secured by rusted metal hinges. Another shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the shaft wall in a shower of brick fragments. They reached the hatch, but found it secured from the outside. "Push," Thomas directed, and all three pressed upward against the wooden barrier. For a terrible moment, it resisted, years of weathering and disuse having sealed it shut. Then, with a splintering crack, it gave way, swinging upward to reveal a patch of blue sky. They emerged into what had once been a small outbuilding, now reduced to little more than a foundation and partial walls. Concealed by overgrown vegetation, it stood perhaps 100 yards from the mansion near the boundary of the property. From this vantage point, they could see Eleanor Prescott's black car parked beside the mansion, along with two unmarked vans whose occupants had presumably been dispatched to search the house. "We need to move quickly," Thomas urged, helping Robert from the platform. "It won't take them long to follow us up." With Michael supporting one side and Thomas the other, they half-carried Robert through the dense undergrowth, heading toward the section of property closest to Thomas's cottage. The canvas bag of documents slowed their progress, but none considered abandoning it even as sounds of pursuit emerged from the elevator shaft behind them. They had almost reached the property boundary when a shout from behind indicated they had been spotted. Three men in dark clothing emerged from the undergrowth, moving with the coordinated precision of professionals rather than casual trespassers. "Split up," Robert commanded. "Thomas, take the documents and get them to Catherine. Michael, go with him. I'll create a diversion." The old caretaker's face registered protest. "We're not leaving you behind, it did." "This isn't a discussion," Robert insisted, his military training asserting itself in the crisis. "Those papers are more important than any of us. Get them to safety, then bring help. That's an order." Thomas recognized the tone of command and reluctantly nodded. Taking the canvas bag and gripping Michael's shoulder, he veered to the right, disappearing into the denser vegetation along the property line. Robert watched them go, then deliberately wheeled himself in the opposite direction, making himself visible to their pursuers. The men took the bait, altering their course to intercept the more visible target. Robert pushed his wheelchair to its limits across the uneven ground, heading toward a small stream that marked one boundary of the Mitchell property. He had no illusion of outrunning professional pursuers, but every moment he delayed them was another moment for Thomas and Michael to reach safety with the documents. The stream presented an impassable barrier for his wheelchair. Robert reached it just as the closest pursuer closed to within 20 yards. Bracing himself against a tree, he pulled himself from the chair and crawled down the embankment toward the water. The action clearly surprised his pursuer, who had expected his quarry to remain handicapped by the wheelchair. Robert used this momentary confusion to his advantage. As the man reached the embankment, Robert surged upward from his position near the water's edge, grabbing the pursuer's legs and pulling him off balance. The man tumbled down the slope, landing heavily in the shallow stream. Before he could recover, Robert struck him with a rock, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to stun him temporarily. The other two pursuers arrived moments later, approaching with more caution after witnessing their colleague's fate. Robert had positioned himself with his back against the embankment, the stream protecting one flank, a fallen tree, providing limited cover on the other side. He brandished another rock, his expression reflecting the calm determination of a man who had faced worse odds in combat. The standoff was interrupted by the distant wail of sirens approaching from the direction of town. One of the pursuers gestured urgently to his companion. "We need to go," Prescott said. "No witnesses, no complications." They retreated, dragging their dazed colleague with them. Within moments, they had disappeared back into the undergrowth, heading toward the mansion where Eleanor's car still waited. Robert remained in position, listening as the sirens grew louder, then culminated in the crunch of tires on the mansion's gravel drive. Sheriff's Deputy Hayes appeared at the top of the embankment a few minutes later, accompanied by Thomas and Catherine. Their expressions registered shock at finding Robert soaked and muddied, his wheelchair abandoned yards away. "Your timing is impeccable," Robert acknowledged as they helped him up the slope. "Though I'd appreciate a more comfortable extraction next time." Catherine's normally composed features were tight with anger. "Those men were professionals, private security Eleanor hired from Richmond, according to my sources. They had no legal right to be on your property, let alone chase you with weapons." Deputy Hayes looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Ms. Prescott claimed she hired them to conduct a security assessment at your request, Mr. Mitchell. Said she was concerned about your safety after rumors of trespassers on the property." "And you believe that?" Catherine's voice could have stripped paint. Hayes had the grace to look ashamed. "The sheriff did, or claimed to. The call about gunshots came from Thomas here, not through official channels." His expression hardened slightly. "But firing weapons on private property without immediate threat to life, that crosses a line even the sheriff can't ignore. We've detained the men for questioning." Once Robert was settled back in his wheelchair, they made their way to the front of the mansion, where a confrontation was unfolding. Eleanor Prescott stood beside her car, engaged in a heated discussion with a uniformed sheriff's officer. Her perfect composure had fractured her platinum hair, slightly disheveled, her gestures more agitated than her carefully cultivated image typically allowed. She fell silent when she caught sight of Robert, her eyes narrowing as they took in his bedraggled appearance and the canvas bag of documents now safely in Catherine's possession. For a moment, naked calculation showed in her expression as she assessed this unexpected development. "Robert," she greeted him with forced cordiality, "thank goodness you're safe. When my security team reported hearing gunshots, I was concerned you might have been hurt by the trespassers they were investigating." Robert held her gaze steadily. "The only trespassers on my property today were the men you sent to steal or destroy documents that could prove your family's fortune was built on fraud and theft." Eleanor's carefully maintained facade cracked further. "That's a slanderous accusation without a shred of evidence." Catherine stepped forward, patting the canvas bag meaningfully. "Actually, we have quite a substantial collection of evidence. Deeds, court records, correspondence, all documenting how the Prescotts systematically stole land from freed slaves and their descendants after the Civil War." She smiled thinly. "Particularly interesting are the mineral survey maps from the 1870s that show your ancestors targeted properties with copper deposits. I imagine the current county commissioner and several state officials would find these documents enlightening." Eleanor's face drained of color. For the first time since Robert had met her, she appeared genuinely rattled. "Whatever you think you found, it's ancient history. The statute of limitations may have expired on the original crimes," Catherine interrupted, "but not on the deliberate concealment of fraud that continued through your father's lifetime and into yours. And certainly not on conspiracy hiring armed men to invade private property and attempted destruction of evidence." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Particularly when the victims were specifically targeted based on race, which makes this a potential federal hate crime spanning generations." The sheriff's officer, who had been listening with increasing concern, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Prescott, I think we should continue this discussion at the station. Your security personnel are making some troubling claims about their instructions regarding Mr. Mitchell and any documents found on the property." Eleanor's composure collapsed entirely. "They're lying. I never authorized—" She stopped, visibly regathering herself. "My attorneys will clarify this unfortunate misunderstanding." As she was escorted to a patrol car, Eleanor turned back toward Robert, her expression hardening into something closer to her true nature. "This isn't over, Mitchell. That house has destroyed everyone who's tried to live in it. You'll be no different." Her gaze shifted to the canvas bag of documents. "And if you think exposing ancient history will change anything in this town, you're deluding yourself. Prescotts have weathered worse storms than you." The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. The documents from the underground chambers were secured in Catherine's store safe. Meredith Sawyer was called in to begin cataloging the evidence and preparing potential legal actions. Thomas's niece from the county records office arrived with additional historical documents that corroborated the Mitchell records and expanded the picture of the Prescotts' systematic land theft. By evening, Catherine's planned gathering of affected families had transformed into something larger, a community meeting held in the back room of her grocery store, attended by nearly 24 people representing families whose ancestors had lost land during the period documented in the Mitchell records. Robert, cleaned up, but still exhausted from the day's ordeal, found himself the center of attention as he explained what they had discovered beneath the mansion. The response was mixed excitement at the possibility of long-delayed justice, skepticism about challenging the Prescott influence, fear of repercussions in a town where Eleanor's reach extended into nearly every institution. "Even with these documents, legal challenges will be difficult after so much time," Meredith cautioned the group. "The current owners of many properties are generations removed from the original fraud. Courts are reluctant to overturn established ownership without compelling reason." "What about the mineral rights?" asked an older man whose grandfather had lost a farm in the northern part of the county. "If the Prescotts knew about the copper deposits when they took our land, that's premeditated fraud on a massive scale." Meredith nodded thoughtfully. "That's potentially our strongest angle. Under certain circumstances, mineral rights can be separated from surface ownership. If we can prove the original transfers were fraudulent and specifically targeted for mineral wealth, we might establish a claim for the descendants on at least a portion of any mining proceeds." The discussion continued late into the night. Strategies debated, alliances formed, old family stories shared that suddenly had new context in light of the documented pattern of Prescott abuses. Throughout it all, Robert observed the community coalescing around a shared history that had been deliberately suppressed, finding strength in the truth that had been preserved in the Mitchell mansion. When the meeting finally concluded, only Thomas, Catherine, Michael, and Meredith remained. They gathered around a table strewn with photocopied documents and legal notepads, the exhaustion of the day evident in their faces but unable to dampen the sense of purpose that united them. Eleanor won't stay in custody long, Meredith warned, gathering her notes. Her attorneys probably already have her released on bail, and this is just the beginning of her counterattack. She'll use every resource, legal and otherwise, to discredit these documents and anyone associated with them. Catherine's weathered face was set in determined lines. Let her try. This town has lived under Prescott influence for too long. People are ready for change, even if they're afraid to admit it publicly yet. Thomas, who had been unusually quiet during the meeting, finally spoke. The mansion itself remains vulnerable. After today, Eleanor knows exactly what's hidden there. She'll find a way to get inside legally or illegally. We need to remove and properly document everything in those underground chambers before she can destroy it. Robert nodded agreement. First thing tomorrow, we go back and retrieve everything, with proper witnesses and documentation to establish chain of custody. And the house itself, Catherine asked. What are your plans for it now? The question gave Robert pause. Until now, his focus had been on uncovering the mansion's secrets and thwarting Eleanor's schemes. The future of the property itself, its restoration, its purpose, had remained secondary to the more immediate battles. But Catherine's question forced him to consider the longer term. I'm not sure yet, he admitted, but I know it needs to be more than just a private residence. The Mitchell legacy deserves a more public recognition. Michael, who had been quietly helping organize the photocopied documents, looked up with sudden animation. What about a museum about the Underground Railroad and what happened after? People should know about what your family did and what happened to families like mine. The suggestion resonated immediately. A museum dedicated to telling the story of the Mitchell family's role in the Underground Railroad and the post-Civil War struggle for Black land ownership and economic justice. A place where the documents hidden for generations could be properly preserved and displayed. A center for research into local history that had been deliberately obscured. That's actually perfect. Robert acknowledged the vision taking shape in his mind. The mansion was built to protect people and preserve truth. It should continue serving that purpose. They departed with renewed determination, plans already forming for the next day's retrieval operation. Robert returned to Thomas's cottage, his body aching from the day's exertions, but his mind too active for immediate sleep. He sat on the porch, gazing toward the distant silhouette of the mansion against the night sky. Thomas joined him, offering a glass of bourbon. Quite a day, the old caretaker observed, settling into a neighboring chair. Your ancestor would be proud. The house chose well when it called you back. Robert sipped the bourbon, its warmth spreading through his tired body. I still don't understand why my great-uncle left it specifically to me. We never even met. Samuel watched you from a distance, kept track of your military service, your injury, your struggles afterward. Thomas gazed into his glass memories, playing across his weathered features. About a month before he died, he showed me your photograph. This is the one, he told me. When the time comes, the house will need him, and he'll need it just as much. I didn't understand then. I'm starting to now. They sat in companionable silence, the night sounds of the countryside enveloping them. Eventually, Thomas spoke again, his voice thoughtful. You know, in all the excitement about the documents and the Prescott fraud, we never finished exploring the tunnel system. That third passage, the one that seemed to lead off the property, I've been wondering where it might go. Robert had been wondering the same thing. The carved map had shown the left passage extending beyond the boundaries of the Mitchell estate, suggesting connections to other properties, perhaps other stations on the Underground Railroad or safe houses for those the Mitchells had helped resettle. Tomorrow, he promised, after we've secured the documents, we'll explore the rest of the tunnels. But tomorrow would bring its own unexpected developments. As dawn broke over Oak Ridge, Robert was awakened by Thomas's urgent knock on his bedroom door. The old caretaker's face was grave as he handed Robert the local newspaper. The headline was bold and accusatory. Mitchell Hare claims fraud threatens local economy. The article beneath, clearly influenced by Prescott interests, portrayed Robert as an opportunistic outsider attempting to extort money from established county families by dredging up distorted historical claims. Most concerning was the revelation that Eleanor had filed an emergency motion for a preservation order that would effectively seal the Mitchell estate, preventing removal of any materials until ownership and historical significance could be properly established by qualified experts. Court hearing is set for 3 this afternoon, Thomas reported grimly. Meredith's already on it, but Eleanor's judge shopping again, trying to find someone sympathetic to her interests. They barely had time to process this setback when Catherine called with worse news. During the night, someone had broken into her store. The safe containing the Mitchell documents was untouched, its modern security having deterred the burglars, but the message was clear. Eleanor was escalating beyond legal maneuvers into more direct intimidation. We need to move now, Robert decided, before the hearing, before she can get that preservation order. We'll empty those chambers completely, document everything, get it all to a secure location outside her reach. Within an hour, they had assembled a team, Thomas, Catherine, Michael, despite his grandmother's initial objections, Meredith to provide legal oversight, and 2 of Thomas's veteran friends who had helped with security at the community meeting. They converged on the Mitchell mansion, a small convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs rolling up the overgrown drive just as the morning mist was burning off the surrounding fields. The mansion stood silent and seemingly undisturbed, but Robert felt a difference in its atmosphere. A tension and awareness, as if the house itself recognized the pivotal moment that had arrived. As they approached the front entrance rather than the side door they had previously used, the massive oak door swung open untouched, welcoming them inside. Michael, walking beside Robert's wheelchair, shivered slightly. "It knows," he whispered. "The house knows we're here to help." They proceeded directly to the library and the hidden trapdoor. With more hands available, the process of transferring documents from the underground chambers proceeded efficiently. They worked in teams, cataloging and photographing each item in situ before carefully packing it for transport. Meredith oversaw the documentation process, ensuring proper chain of custody that would stand up to legal scrutiny. Robert coordinated from the library, his military training evident in the organized operation. The main storage chamber was systematically emptied. First, its contents filling 3 pickup trucks, secured with tarps and destined for a bank vault in the neighboring county where Eleanor's influence was weaker. As midday approached, they turned their attention to the second chamber they had discovered, the one containing the legal records of Prescott fraud. This material was potentially the most damaging to Eleanor and required the most careful handling to preserve its evidentiary value. "We should consider exploring that third passage before we leave," Thomas suggested as they worked. "If it connects to another property, it might provide insight into other families involved in the Underground Railroad network, potential allies, and what's coming." Robert checked his watch, calculating the time remaining before the court hearing. "We'll make a quick reconnaissance once the documents are secured, but our priority has to be protecting what we've already found." The systematic emptying of the second chamber revealed additional surprises, hidden compartments behind the main filing cabinets, containing personal journals from Samuel Mitchell that detailed his legal battles against the Prescotts in more intimate terms than the formal records. These journals revealed that the conflict between the families had nearly erupted into violence on multiple occasions, with Jeremiah Prescott once attempting to burn the mansion while Samuel and his family slept within. Most significantly, they discovered a sealed metal box hidden beneath a false bottom in one of the cabinets. Unlike the other containers in the chamber, this one bore no label, only the Mitchell family crest stamped into its lid. The box was locked with no key immediately evident. "Should we open it?" Catherine asked, holding the box with reverent air. Robert considered the question. The box had been deliberately concealed beyond the already hidden chamber, suggesting its contents were especially sensitive or valuable. "Not here," he decided finally. "Let's get it to safety first, then examine it properly with appropriate documentation." As the last of the documents were being loaded into the waiting vehicles, Robert finally had an opportunity to investigate the third tunnel passage, the one that appeared to lead beyond the Mitchell property. With Thomas and Michael accompanying him, he made his way back through the underground system to the junction where the 3 passages diverged. The left passage was narrower than the others, its construction rougher, suggesting it might have been added later or built with greater haste. It descended more steeply, the air growing noticeably cooler as they progressed. After approximately 100 yards, the passage leveled out, and the construction quality improved again, with brick-lined walls and timber supports, similar to those in the main system. They reached what appeared to be another junction where the passage split again. One branch continued straight ahead, while the other curved to the left. Both disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. "We don't have time to explore fully," Robert noted reluctantly. "The court hearing is in less than 2 hours and we need to be there with Meredith." Thomas nodded agreement, but pointed to markings on the wall near the junction, more of the star and circle symbols they had seen elsewhere, but arranged differently. "These might tell us where the passages lead if we could decipher them." Michael, whose young eyes caught details the older men missed, noticed something protruding slightly from the wall near the symbols. "There's something here like a small drawer." Indeed, a rectangular section of the brick wall had been designed to slide outward. When Michael pulled gently, it revealed a concealed compartment containing a folded piece of oilskin. Inside was a map, hand-drawn but precisely detailed, showing the complete tunnel system beneath, not just the Mitchell mansion, but extending across multiple properties throughout the northern part of the county. The map confirmed their speculation. The Mitchell tunnels connected to other safe houses that had been part of the Underground Railroad network. The straight passage ahead linked to what was labeled as Parker Homestead, while the left branch extended towards several other properties, including one marked as Sawyer Farm. "Parker," Michael repeated, the significance dawning on him. "That's my family's original land before they lost most of it during the Depression." "And Sawyer," Thomas added, "like Meredith Sawyer, our lawyer." The connections were expanding the historical network, revealing itself as still relevant in the present. The families who had worked together in the Underground Railroad, who had supported each other against Prescott aggression, were still linked generations later, their descendants now united again in a new struggle for justice. They reluctantly abandoned further exploration, marking the junction carefully on their copy of the map for future investigation. Time was running short, and the court hearing demanded their presence if they hoped to counter Eleanor's legal maneuvers. As they made their way back to the mansion's main floor, Robert felt the weight of the Mitchell legacy settling more firmly on his shoulders. The house had indeed been waiting for him, as Thomas had suggested. Not simply as an inheritance, but as a mission to complete the work his ancestors had begun, to bring long-delayed justice to families who had suffered from the Prescott's greed, and perhaps in the process to find healing for his own broken life. The mansion that had once seemed a burden, a cruel joke at the expense of a disabled veteran, had revealed itself as something else entirely, a fortress of memory, a repository of truth, and now potentially a center for community renewal. As they emerged into the library where the last boxes of documents were being carried out to the waiting vehicles, Robert looked up at the portrait of Samuel Mitchell still hanging on the wall. For a moment, in the shifting light of the room, he could have sworn the stern face softened, the painted eyes warming with approval. Then Catherine called his name, breaking the spell, and he turned toward the door, toward the future that awaited beyond the mansion's walls, a future he now faced not with resignation, but with purpose. The Mitchell heir had claimed his inheritance, not just of property and history, but of responsibility and mission. And in doing so, he had begun to reclaim himself.